I'm here in two roles. Number one, I'm the managing partner for a firm called ATKearney in Australia. And number two, I also lead our customer innovation practice globally. Innovation is something that everybody is keen on these days, right? And not surprising, because you can only cost cut your way to greatness so long and so far. It's really hard to just pretend like innovation is a process or a script that you follow. And we call that concept innovation theater, which is the look and feel of innovation, but nothing really happening under the hood. When I took over the role of customer innovation lead for the firm, I went around the world and spoke to 100 CEOs across multiple countries. It took me 6 months to have that set of conversations. And what was really clear in those conversations is that the percentage of CEOs who actually believe that they're getting the return on investment or actually any tangible material results from innovation is 20%. Right? So only 1 in 5 CEOs said, yeah, actually, I think we're making progress. 4 in 5 CEOs were frustrated that there were wheels turning, there was a lot of effort underway, but it wasn't materially affecting the valuation, wasn't materially affecting the bottom line. Now, obviously, we can get into platitudes like innovation is about culture, it's a whole of organization, all of that stuff. I'm not going to take 15 minutes of your time. But really, at the risk of maybe being too specific or too practical, get into sort of 10 practices that are really making a difference. So let's get started. So firstly, when we talk about innovation, I don't know if you noticed, but very often we focus on the hammers looking for the nails. The business question that innovation should answer is really where we absolutely need to begin, right? And aligning with business leaders up front. Now, very often when we especially have the labs or the venturing models, part of the fun of that is to have an independent bunch of people empowered, funded, etc. The problem is, at some point in this entire journey, they're going to come up with interesting ideas. And at that point, you can take any of the companies in Australia, many of the companies in Australia, I should say, they'll say, hey, I've incubated this great idea, who wants it? And at that point, the business leaders go, yeah, nah, because we have other things to do. So it's really important up front to actually get somebody to be an internal buyer of whatever you're going to work on. The second two are in ideation, you really want to cast a very wide net. Startups, very interesting experience with one of the venturing labs that I've collaborated with. Very often startups labs like to pretend, corporate labs or corporate venturing teams like to pretend like they are venture funds or private equity funds, right? Because they've embraced that DNA, they want to behave in that way. Many of the people come from there. The main problem here is what the tech startups are seeking is not funding, because there's a lot of options for funding. What they really want is access to customers and access to the world. So if I was an insurance company setting up a venturing lab, yes, the fact that I have X million dollars to invest is a good thing. But really what I need to do, especially the Australian insurers which don't, or even the multinational insurers in Australia which have international footprints, and say, prove it in Australia and we'll help you take it to the world. And if we don't have an international footprint, we will partner with non-competing insurers around the world so that we create a platform where you're not boxed in. Because the biggest concern on speaking to the tech startups and those where I'm on the board is I don't want to get into a corporate where I'm successful in the near term, but then I'm boxed or limited in the long term. On the process side, as I mentioned, the stage gates and the templates, etc., are all interesting and good. But very often they can suffocate innovation. And that's because innovation comes in multiple flavors, at least in 3. There's what I call core innovation, which you can model in terms of P&L impact, etc. There's growth innovation, which you have to model in terms of NPV. And there's exploratory innovation, which you have to model in terms of risk multiples, right? They actually have very different levels of volatility, very different levels of granularity. And if you run all three through a single process, 2 of them are going to suffocate. So you probably need a triple track model, or at least a dual track model to handle different kinds of questions and different kinds of innovations. And then, taking a leaf out of lean startup or agile, I definitely do believe that innovation can never be an 18-month program in itself, right? So we should be talking about 12 weeks. And the question I ask my clients and my teams is not, how long will this take, but really, what can you do in 12 weeks, right? And that whole shift about what's possible in a time box period versus how much money is this going to take, how long is this going to run, is a very different mindset from normal business planning. So again, I don't care how much money you need for an idea. I want to know what can you do with the first $100,000. And finally, in terms of measuring outcomes of profitability, not finally, sorry, I have one more to go. We very often talk about innovation in terms of inputs. We invested these many dollars. We have these many ideas in the funnel. We have these many ideas going into production. That's all good, but that's input and outcomes. Outputs. What I'm really keen on is outcomes. And especially if we've defined the problems up front. So one of my clients was trying to penetrate the $1 billion revenue opportunity in young parents for financial services. Now, the beauty of defining a problem that well is it's a $1 billion opportunity. There are 417,000 households in Australia at any point in time that are either 1 year prior to pregnancy, 9 months of pregnancy, or 1 year after. And we know that on average, an Australian family spends $2,500 on financial institutions every year that they're in that window. So we know that it's a $1 billion opportunity, and we can track how many of these 417,000 families has your innovation been able to touch, and how much of the $2,500 are you able to tap into. And finally, the question is, when's the right time to hand over? I'm a firm believer in the fact that you hand over when an idea is not just launched, but you hand over when an idea is not what I call metric dilutive. The big parts of our businesses are running on quarterly plans, they're running on dividend targets, they're running on total shareholder return situations. Which basically means if you hand over anything to the main business, antibodies will kick in if it's dilutive, right? So what you absolutely need is some sort of holding ground where a business is ramped up to a point where it's not dilutive. It may not be accretive, but it's not dilutive. That's the right point in time to hand over, especially if that business has been a buyer of the concept from day one. And finally, on enablement, if you set up a lab, there are actually multiple roles the lab can play, and it's absolutely critical to answer the mandate question. Are you a business with a P&L responsibility or a value creation responsibility, or are you a shared service? A set of capabilities that the rest of the organization can draw on, right? And very often we get those two conflated, confused. Secondly, if we are talking about building capabilities, no amount of boot camps and trainings is going to be enough, right? Not even hackathons, right? What we actually need to do is follow the principle of learn and do. So adults learn 80% by doing, 20% by sitting in a classroom. So what we need to do is actually give them something, get them to execute it, give them something else, get them to execute it, and it's as much part of the... And then finally, there is no way in which we can do what we want to do without embracing an ecosystem. But the one thing I'd say about the ecosystem is I like to create ecosystems around domains or specific business problems as opposed to generic ecosystems for a company as a whole. Before opening up to question and answers, let me just give you a run-through of a hypothetical example to bring this to life. So firstly, imagine any contract or subscription-based business. It could be a utility company, it could be an insurance company, anything that has annual contracts, right? Two innovation problem definitions, or what I call domains, could be, how do I win over the competitors' non-price sensitive customers? All of us know in contract businesses or subscription businesses, 40% or so of the customers are highly price sensitive. What we don't normally attack is there's 60% of your competitors' customers, by definition, that are not price sensitive, right? And if I can get them over, I'll need to get them over with something other than price. And then the second definition could be, how do I reduce my cost to serve so that I can retain my own price-sensitive customers? This is not the comprehensive set of questions, but these are the kind of innovation domains that I'm talking about, agreeing upfront, right? And then you get the business buyers who basically say, yep, those are problems worth solving. This is how much it's worth to me. This is how much the funding could be, which will be delivered in sprint funding. Now, we may then say, okay, for this non-price sensitive customer problem statement, what are the sources of non-price sensitive differentiation that I can scan the market for, right? Value adds, apps. And then for the sources of operational efficiency, you may look at another set of ideation partners, supply chains, right? Your own employees for identifying inefficiencies in the organization. You then have put in place a process that segregates into growth, core, and exploratory. And for the core, maybe you ask the business to lead, right? After all, it's a P&L based concept. They can drive it through. So many of the operational ideas could be driven by, innovation could be driven through the businesses. On the other hand, for the growth and exploratory ones, you may want to incubate it in a lab because those ideas can be price dilutive, higher variability, et cetera. But in all cases, you're going to fund in 12-week sprints, right, in this case. And then at the end, you'll actually track against your original problem definition, right? So you'll track win rates of competitors' customers. You'll track the customer unit costs. So you're not just tracking what you're putting in or how much innovation you're doing, you're actually tracking to see against the problem definitions, are you moving the needle? And that's the language of the CEO, that's the language of the board, and that's the language of the analysts, right? And then when I talk to the CEOs, they won't be saying 1 in 5 are satisfied because they're actually getting commercial outcomes. On the growth and exploratory ideas, again, would not hand them over until they've reached metric neutral positions. And finally, in terms of the enablement, in this case, the lab is primarily a business incubating those growth and exploratory areas. The fact of the matter is, for an adult learning perspective, whatever process you put in place, it's never going to work exactly that way. So what you want to do is, for the first 4 to 5 ideas going through the system, you really want to have hyper-K, right? You want to have oversight, you want to have an ability to debottleneck, you want to have the ability to, in a sense, do meta-agile on yourself. Agile fits on the agile process that you're putting in place, right? And then finally, you obviously have these supply chain partners and tech startups that you bring in that are core to your ecosystem. And one interesting idea is to actually always put in place a champion-challenger model, which is, because you constantly want new ideas to come up. For example, if you're using machine learning for anything, there's a ton of boutiques out there. I'd always give 80% of my portfolio to one and 20% to the other. And by the way, same applies to consultants. Here's a hint for you, right? So that you can play them off against each other. And if one starts to lag behind or stop being at the innovative frontier, you can always swap them out because you have another option and they become the champion, and then you put another challenger in place, right? So these kind of constructs can actually help keep the ecosystem vibrant as opposed to start in a bang and then fizzle out over time. What this actually drives, to just conclude, is obviously speed, a lot of less wheel spinning. Also agility. Why do I say agility? Not in the sense of agile as a process, but agility because by changing the problem definitions that we are agreeing to work on, by changing the strategy, by changing the domains, you can actually repoint your innovation capability very quickly in a new direction. You haven't sort of set the rails for the next 24 months, right? It's that control point is actually the first question that you ask. Employee engagement, the amount of frustration that employees face, there's always this, yeah, we're going to be agile, we're going to be innovative, and then, oh my God, we're not. Moment that we can avoid, because some of these things get over the typical hurdles. But the most important thing from a commercial perspective, and quite frankly for me, is that your return on investment, every dollar that you put in, actually goes through to driving commercial innovation, as opposed to innovation theater, as I called it at the start. So, as Alan said, you guys are as much experts in this area as I am. So I share these ideas and practices, hopefully to build the pool of common knowledge, but would very much welcome any questions. Thank you very much.